the ongoing state of brain function can contribute to the likelihood of someone developing PTSD from a single or an acute event that happens. Okay, so again, it doesn't have to do so much with the event itself, but what's the state of their brain when the event occurs or in the time period after the event occurs. And where the overlap is that CPTS basically rewires our brain along the way. A complex trauma occurring over a longer period of time with repeated events or situations that we're put into that are emotionally unsafe cause this rewiring to happen. And a lot of the time, CPTS does occur during childhood, and that's when the conditioning happens, but it doesn't have to. Someone could go through a long-term relational situation, whether that be a personal relationship or a work relationship or other, in their 30s or in their 40s that could cause CPTS.
Did you know that after a traumatic event, our brains initially store fear memories as broad associations, but over time, they become specific episodic memories? However, individuals with high anxiety can struggle with this integration, leading to a persistent fear and increased risk for PTSD. And so we want to look today at why do some individuals recover from trauma while others develop PTSD? We're going to look at some new research that shows the answer may be in how our brains encode fear and process memories. Because resilience isn't just a psychological concept, it's really deeply tied to how our brain and our body interact to adapt to stressors, challenges, social demands. This episode dives into recent breakthroughs in PTSD research and the evolving understanding of fear memories, important new discoveries in brain areas for emotional processing, and then how these two really intersect. We're joined again by Matt Bush, founder of Next Level Neuro and a lead educator in the Neurosomatic Intelligence course, to really explore how these insights impact the tools and the strategies we can use in the work of trauma resolution. Welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co-host, Elizabeth Kristoff, founder of brainbase.com, an online community that uses applied neurology and somatics for resilience, emotional processing, and behavior change. And I'm also the founder of the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification, which is an ICF-accredited certification for coaches, therapists, and practitioners to bring transformation to clients and bridge the gap from the mind to the body by working with the nervous system.
And I'm your co-host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide, and I bring your nervous system into your peak somatic experiences. And I'm also an educator at the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification. And Matt, I'm so excited to have you here. This is a topic that you actually came to us with. So I'm excited to hear why this was important to you and how this kind of came about that you wanted to record on PTSD.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I'm excited to be here again. I think at this point I've lost count of the number of episodes I've been able to be on with you too, but I love being here. This topic was really interesting to me because it aligns with what we teach in NSI, for one, about how the brain actually organizes and then creates a lot of the symptoms that we find ourselves experiencing or clients presenting with as what we call outputs, basically protective mechanisms or action signals that are trying to get our attention. And the study that we're going to talk about in the topic today kind of goes into how that happens, why PTSD develops in some but not others, and it just overlaps really nicely with a lot of the topics that are in this season of the podcast. So when I came across the research, it was just published in October of 2024, so just a month ago at the time of our recording today. Kind of mind-blowing about how specifically they can now identify the mechanisms of PTSD formation in many cases. And the brain areas that are involved are specifically some that we've talked about on the podcast and that are targeted with our neurotraining tools. So it just seemed to be a great intersection to explore this kind of stuff.
Do you want to give us a high-level overview of the research and what kind of came up for you as you were looking through it?
Yeah, for sure. So in reading this research, this was published in October, and the idea behind the research is to discover why some people develop PTSD after a traumatic experience or a fear-based experience while other people do not. And what they discovered in looking through the individuals that were surveyed for the research is that it did not have very much to do with the type of experience that it was, the timing of when it was experienced, the intensity of that experience, nor the physical or emotional injury or kind of ongoing consequences. All right. So kind of differentiated the results of PTSD from anything that had actually happened. And what they discovered is that the difference between those who do and those who don't develop is actually something that is in the brain. It's not the event, it's the nervous system of the individual. And so the way they describe it is they say that a fear memory, which may eventually turn into something like PTSD, fear memories start as very broad associations. Like think of a blanket statement in a conversation or a gross oversimplification of an emotion. Like if someone goes, why are you angry? You might think, I'm not angry, I'm frustrated. I'm not angry, I'm overwhelmed. I'm not angry, I'm disappointed. And to you in that situation, just as an example, there may be more nuance, but to the person on the outside, they're kind of making a blanket statement of, you kind of look angry, right? So when we go through these experiences, our brain is like, I'm experiencing a response of fear. And at first, these fear memories and fear associations are very broad. But what happens over time is that these associations then evolve into specific time-based memories. They're located at a specific point in time, having to do with a specific experience. So another way to say that is our brain basically prunes away or discards the generalized fear response in preference to the more specific fear of this particular event or type of stimulus. Okay. So what they found actually happens in the brain and nervous system is that people who don't have as much practiced control in their hippocampus, which is the memory formation center, they don't do as good of a job into isolating and making these memories really time specific. So they stay more general and they stay more broad. And now the language they use in the article is that people with anxiety struggle to form these episodic memories. They retain more of the broad fear response, the broad associations. And the thing about holding on to a broad association is that means that it's more likely to be triggered by various types of situations or sensory input, right? The more specific it is, the more isolated it is in the future. So we may talk about that a little bit more as we go through, but individuals, they say with anxiety. In the podcast, I want to change that just a little bit because we talk about anxiety as another output, right? So it's not that someone who has a label of anxiety is going to be poor at creating these episodic memories. The way I read this is to say individuals who either are already under high threat and experiencing anxiety as an output, or individuals who have been conditioned to perceive more threat. So that would include CPTS, as well as neurodivergence in some cases, or other ongoing chronic threat conditions. When the brain perceives more threat all the time, the hippocampus kind of gets stuck in survival mode, along with a lot of the rest of the brain, and it's not as good at creating these episodic memories. So the two things that are required, and then I'll stop talking because I want to hear what you two have to say about this. The two things that are required to change a broad fear-based memory into a specific episodic memory are really good activation in this hippocampus and really good activation in the prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And we know those are two areas that are often underactive, underperforming when someone is in any type of chronic threat or CPTS type of a situation. So that's where we start the conversation.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive a little more into specifically how this relates to CPTS, but kind of want to broadly summarize and highlight some of these key brain areas for people just as they're taking this in. So initially, a fear memory starts as this broad generalized association, and then later it becomes episodic, tied to a specific event. And that involves the hippocampus initially in the early stages, and then the prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, later integrates the event into more of a coherent sequence. And so our prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is what really helps us to organize and shift the memory from that broad associative fear response into these time-linked memories. And that's really important for not having that overactivity, that fear response occurring all of the time. So it's essentially a regulator for our emotional responses. It's communicating with the amygdala and other emotional processing regions. And that is really important for our ability to reframe or reduce the emotional intensity of memories. And it helps our cognitive processing, and it helps us recover from these traumatic events. So if we have folks with PTSD, with CPTS, with heightened anxiety, there's often a reduced activity shown in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And then there's going to be difficulty organizing traumatic memories and distinguishing between past threats and present threats. And then you have this perpetual fear response that's happening. So when we can work with our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to support its function, that's going to help with resilience, because it allows us to reinterpret and integrate these different traumatic experiences into our broader life narrative.
So I really want to talk about memory a little bit and how our brain is impacted through our development. The brain structures are impacted through our development through these fear responses, and how we really do develop in a training ground when we are growing up. And so a huge facet of trauma is really the inability to integrate memories and experiences. And so when I hear you talking about this more broad fear memory, that just feels so relative, because I hear, even in my own story, how I would feel really stuck in repeating patterns, repeating emotional experiences, or repeating trauma bonds, relational patterns. And so I love this new kind of reframe that we're going into. And for me, what really comes to mind is one of the episodes that Elizabeth and I did before on memory, because what we're talking about is memories, trauma memories, not getting stored in a particular way. And then these experiences affect us in our present day and on a daily basis. And it can be really immobilizing us. They can be ways that we don't take action or that we protect ourselves. And a lot of this has to do with the way that our hormones are experienced in the stress response. And as we are going through our developmental stages as a young child or as an adolescent, what we're doing is basically training our nervous systems for how we are going to survive in the world, in our relationships, not just physically, but also socially. And memories don't exist in an immature hippocampus. And in my own personal experience, I have PTSD on top of CPTS. There are things that I do really remember in my stories, and there are overlapping threads, because these adverse experiences, they can happen to us all through our development into our adulthood and even into our lives right now.
I want to tease out one quick thing that Jen said there that's really important in the first part of what she was saying, is that when we're in high threat or kind of stuck in survival mode, the hippocampus really struggles to record episodic memories and the factual details of any events or situations that have happened. Instead, it records more of the emotional memories. It records the fear. It records, the freeze, the anger, all of those things that come along with. And so the conditioning of the hippocampus is what we're going to get into when we talk about CPTS, because if someone has been in a survival state for a long time, their hippocampus will have been largely conditioned to record more emotion-based memory, not as much episodic and factual-based memory. That's a really huge point of knowledge to understand where we're going with the rest of the podcast. But also when we start to talk about what can I do about it? How can I train my prefrontal cortex? How can I get my hippocampus to rewire and re-educate on these memories? Understanding that is going to be one of the big keys.
I think as we dive into all of this, especially in terms of like hippocampal development, we want to look a little bit at the differences between CPTS and PTSD, just to kind of keep parceling these apart, because they can overlap, certainly. Like Jen was talking about, I have PTSD from some acute incidences, and I also have complex trauma from more prolonged stress. And it does impact our brain development and our nervous system differently. So when we're talking about PTSD, that's usually something that's triggered by experiencing or witnessing a singular traumatic event, like a natural disaster, an accident, an assault, maybe a combat event. And the hallmark of PTSD is that the trauma is typically acute. It's one or a few discrete incidences, and the nervous system's response becomes stuck in a hypervigilant or dysregulated state around that event. So you can have intrusive memories or flashbacks of that particular event. You can avoid reminders or triggers associated with that trauma. You might become hypervigilant or have an exaggerated startle response. There's some emotional numbness that comes with that, sleep disturbances. These symptoms or outputs definitely overlap with complex trauma, but complex trauma is usually referring to chronic exposure to trauma. It's occurring over an extended period of time. A lot of times that's in our childhood, but it doesn't have to be. And it's this ongoing, repeated interpersonal trauma or interpersonal abuse, neglect, living and being conditioned by emotionally unsafe environments that really disrupts our emotional neurological development. So unlike PTSD, CPTS is not about one specific incident, but prolonged, and it's almost always relational, having to do with harm or lack of support, safety, and attunement. And that's often inflicted by caregivers or perhaps authority figures, and it leaves a really deep imprint, especially on our social brain, social nervous system, our ability to connect with others. So you might experience a lot of emotional dysregulation, deep negative self-perception, a very heightened shame response, difficulty with trust and boundaries in relationships, having a chronic dissociation response, feeling disconnected from yourself, a lot of deeply somatic symptoms like chronic pain, gastrointestinal issues, chronic fatigue, and this overall persistent sense of danger, even when you're in safe environments or safe relationships. And again, these disruptions lead to a nervous system that is in a chronic or perpetually dysregulated state. You have the hyperarousal, or you can have chronic freeze or shutdown. And it's more triggered by relational stress than acute environmental triggers. So when we're talking about memory consolidation, I think that's where some of this interventions get a little complex when you're addressing complex trauma, because you have some interventions like EMDR that work really well for an acute incident like PTSD, but they do not have the same success rate when you're working with CPTS, because there's just so many events that it's the environment that someone is living in and being shaped by. And that's where I think it becomes really important to have ongoing repatterning, this daily training of working with the nervous system, processing emotions, cultivating safe relationships, because there's a whole time span of development and patterning that we're looking at. But I also think that this research on PTS is important to look at here, because we can see what does make someone more resilient to developing PTSD, look at the brain areas that are really important, and think about how that could overlap to rehabilitate CPTS as well. We're living in a time where deeper leadership, emotional resilience, and nervous system skills aren't just optional. They're essential. If you're ready to upgrade the way you lead yourself and others, join us for a free workshop, The Neurosomatics of Leadership and Belief Change, on July 9th. It's practical, science-based, and specifically for practitioners who want to make a real impact. Go to neurosomatic.com/leadership to register. That's neurosomatic.com/leadership. We hope to see you there.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to look at this current research as well as what we know about PTSD and what happens in the brain and how that does relate to CPTS. There is some overlap. So the big areas that we generally talk about are the amygdala, for one, right? Our threat detection area, the hippocampus with how it forms memories and performs memory recall, and the prefrontal cortex. And there's both the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that's kind of like the top outside area of the frontal lobe. And in a very simplified way, you can think that that responds to the external world and external events and people and relationships. And then there's also what's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is like the lower inside part of the frontal lobe. And that has a lot to do, in a very general sense, with thoughts and feelings and associations about me or about you personally as an individual. So those are the big areas of overlap. And what we know from talking about developmental trauma and developmental time periods is that when those survival brain areas, especially the amygdala and the hippocampus, are conditioned to be hypervigilant or hyper-aware, if they're in their survival mode, they're more likely to see and experience threatening situations or threatening relationships from multiple angles, multiple vectors more often. So what this study does in looking at PTSD first is it allows us to see that the ongoing state of brain function can contribute to the likelihood of someone developing PTSD from a single or an acute event that happens. Okay. So again, it doesn't have to do so much with the event itself, but what's the state of their brain when the event occurs or in the time period after the event occurs. And where the overlap is that kind of what Elizabeth just said is that CPTS basically rewires our brain along the way. A complex trauma occurring over a longer period of time with repeated events or situations that we're put into that are emotionally unsafe cause this rewiring to happen. And a lot of the time, CPTS does occur during childhood, and that's when the conditioning happens. But it doesn't have to. Someone could go through a long-term relational situation, whether that be a personal relationship or a work relationship or other, in their 30s or in their 40s that could cause CPTS. But what causes CPTS to occur, and this is a bit of an overstatement, but just simplifying, is that reconditioning of the brain areas based on the relational situation, of course, that's causing them to be stuck in survival mode. It's rewiring their perspective on the world, how they take in sensory information, and then what they perceive and what they do with it. This study is kind of saying PTSD is essentially the same thing, that as the brain has been rewired or conditioned, that now we see that PTSD also comes from the same brain changes, not from the external event.
And there are so many different available therapies for us now. Elizabeth was kind of talking about the difference between acute and chronic. And when I think about my experiences, how I'm talking about the PTSD stacked on the complex trauma, I think of like sexual offenses, like body boundary violations, right? That would be a PTSD where I can see where maybe if I had this isolated violent sexual experience, I could go to some therapy, maybe do some MDR, where some of these more, these alternate therapies are, even cognitive behavioral therapy might be good in the resolution of that. But because of this fear-based broader memory that I have and the adverse experience of sexual abuse and violence, I can see how it is not easy for me to isolate an experience that I remember, say, in the sex trafficking experience of mine or any, there's several experiences in my 20s that I could highlight right now, like why I can't just heal that in an isolated space. I have to go into how my broader memory is affected and this broader fear memory, right? And so for me, NSI, obviously hugely important. We're going to get to that, especially in these brain areas. But people like and me are drawn to more peak somatic experiences, right? That's the work that I do in psychedelic therapy. And so, but I really do believe that some of these peak somatic experiences can be really overwhelming due to disrupted memory integration. And, you know, it's been confirmed by neuroscientific research that trauma is often remembered through behavioral enactments, and that traumatized people are frequently unable to even speak about their experiences, but can be compelled to reenact them, and often remaining unaware of like really how their behavior is really speaking and what it is really saying. And so physical movements and sensations, these automatic responses and involuntary movements, they can really come up in a peak somatic experience. It's really characteristic of trauma that traumatic memories may also be able to take the form of unconscious acting out behaviors, and then the need to resolve traumatic experiences can fuel repetitive and compulsive actions and behaviors. And so people are drawn to these big peak somatic experiences, but one of the huge factors that I see here as an issue is dissociation, right? We know dissociation is a huge factor of complex post-traumatic stress, but why wouldn't it also be a factor in PTS, right? When you're in a situation that is acute, you would also want to leave your body. And so going into these experiences and not having a continuum of consciousness, it can be a barrier when we can't feel our bodies, when we can't feel and hear the sensations of our bodies. So like that lack of embodiment and like presence is really a component of healing and being in these peak somatic experiences. So for us, the three of us, we define peak somatic experiences as a method of releasing stored survival energy that's bound in the body after a trauma, releasing the emotions that come with it by relying on the body's natural intelligence to relieve it. But if I can't hear my body's natural intelligence, I'm not going to be able to relieve the trauma that's in my body. And so a question that comes up is like, why are some individuals in this spaces able to feel the healing and why others would be traumatized by these experiences? And for me, that really does come down in my experience to what I've witnessed into dissociation and the components of complex traumatic stress or PTSD, that those brain areas that really do keep us disconnected and keep us cut off from the body and not able to experience the resilience that happens from a mind-body soul connection.
Yeah. When I'm talking with clients about that or similar questions, I typically use a metaphor. They go, you've been working on this for some time. It's kind of like you've been training to run a marathon. Like maybe you decided you wanted to run a marathon. You signed up for the race. You've been training for it because, often they've been doing somatic work. They may be doing therapy or other techniques. And then it's like, now that it's the day of the race, you got to the marathon, but you found out you had to park like 5 miles away from the starting line. So now you're in this situation where you're looking at the day overall and you're going, not only do I have to run 26 miles, I got to walk 5 miles to the starting line. And then when I'm finished, I'm going to have to walk 5 miles back. And sometimes what happens is that when someone is in a dissociation or a loop of CPTS symptoms, when they do come up to the surface and cognitively have that awareness of like, oh crap, I'm dissociated right now, it's like recognizing they're 5 miles away from the starting line. And it's sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's like this overwhelming sense of, I'm so far back, I don't know what to do. Or now that I'm aware of my body, even that little bit of awareness when I come up and peek up to the surface and find my body creates another wave of threat. Because what do I do with that information? Where does that fit in the big picture? Like it engages all types of questions in the cognitive brain. And so it can often create another negative loop or kind of a tailspin feeling where they go even deeper into the dissociation again. So I think what is ultimately required, and this is a very broad statement, but what is ultimately required to kind of move out of those loops and move past and into a place where we can have a healthy experience of somatic expression is often found in getting some of these brain areas a little bit more integrated and more healthy. I don't mean healthy, unhealthy as in a disease state, but in a functional way. So we improve the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex primarily by connecting them with other brain areas that feed them good activation and accurate sensory information. So we often start with sensory and regulation tools. We do daily practice of neuro, and as much as possible, we create a safe environment that supports the work that someone is going through. And we'll never be able to eliminate all possible triggers or all possible relationships, but creating as much as we can of a safe space to be able to slowly reintegrate those brain areas and essentially re-educate them, to condition them back to a more functional level of connection with the rest of the brain.
I think that's so important because if we're looking at how this memory integration is impaired and the dissociation, like Jen was talking about, the lack of movement and emotional processing, going into these big healing experiences can be really difficult if we haven't already started to create change in the way that we integrate and consolidate memories, our ability to process them, our ability to emotionally regulate. There's just so much that can be done in preparation and for integration around that. And that kind of leads me to another study that we were looking at as well in terms of the cerebellum's role in emotional processing and cognitive function that I think could really overlap here with some of that somatic experience and our ability to integrate and process memories. Do you want to talk a little bit about that article, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. So another newer research article just published in the fall of 2024 really expands our understanding of what the cerebellum does. One of the coolest things about this research, and it's really fun anytime you find research that supports something that you've already been proposing. And in applied neurology, we've known what the cerebellum does in regards to movement, and we've been suggesting through NSI and on the podcast that we think the cerebellum is involved in regulating emotional outputs and social outputs. And this article seems to point directly to that and go, yep, that's exactly how it works. So for a long time, the basic responsibilities of the cerebellum were known to be involved with controlling motor function, that is movement, right? Making sure the muscles balance with other muscles, that joints move correctly through smooth actions. So we're not, robotic in the way that we move. The cerebellum also helps maintain our balance and our coordination. It functions to regulate the speed of our movement, all of these kinds of things. And in the last several years, there has been some research on how the cerebellum also has an impact on cognitive abilities. In the way this was described, we should have said this with the movement section. I'll just take one step back here. But the way that the cerebellum coordinates all those motor functions is essentially by eliminating all unwanted movements. And in recent years, as our understanding expanded to include cognitive abilities, the statement was basically adopted that the cerebellum helps to eliminate unwanted thoughts. So it keeps our cognitive brain on track. It helps with our concentration, our direction. It eliminates distractions because those are the unwanted cognitive thoughts. And then this recent research from the fall, it points to the same functions for emotional and social functioning. So they now would say, essentially, the cerebellum helps to eliminate or control unwanted emotions or non-helpful, non-serving emotions. And it also helps to regulate social understanding and social behaviors. So this is really interesting because the more that we learn about this brain area, the more we recognize that it is a center or a hub of integration of all the different sensory inputs we receive, and then keeping us on track, keeping us focused to be able to do the things or respond in the ways that we want to, while not accidentally doing the things that we don't want to.
I am always so fascinated by the role of the cerebellum in emotional regulation and also like social processing and relieving social stress, because the more I work with my own body and with clients, the more I see movement isn't just important in like our ability to walk well or execute big movements well, but there's also this deep movement that comes with emotional processing and emotional regulation. There's an interplay between our diaphragm and our vocal cords and the intrinsic muscles of the core, and these things also have to be coordinated and mobile. The interplay between these to be able to vocalize, to be able to express, like emotional expression is a somatic experience, and there is movement involved, there's vocalization involved, our vocals have to be supported by our breath, and all of this tends to get locked up and restricted, especially with chronic freeze and chronic dissociation. And I have really found, even in my own vocal work and training, if I can pair that with like real neurosomatic tools that increase fuel and activation to my cerebellum, coordinated, intentional, nonlinear movements, I get different results in my ability to be able to vocalize and express and coordinate these movements. And I'm priming my nervous system for emotional processing. And I can have a very different experience in those emotional processing sessions where I don't dissociate, I don't freeze and lock up. My body is functioning well. And there's this, I don't know how to describe it other than this really well-coordinated interplay happening that allows for that expression to be different. So beyond just the regulation and like the inhibition of unwanted emotions, I do also think it has a big role in our ability to express and emotionally regulate that way as well.
I completely echo you on the cerebellum training, and it's so fascinating the way it does have an interplay with emotions. And I think you just highlighted so clearly why movement and coordination of movement are so important for being able to have a productive somatic experience, right? And being able to integrate the experience of our healing on top of what we know. And that's kind of what I was saying about embodying truth before. there's a truth that I know from just the loops that play in my head from these experiences, right? There's a false truth. There's a false narrative. It's protective. The neurotags are protective. But what we're talking about here is being able to rewire that and feel a new truth that comes in and through the body as well. And I think you've just really highlighted that beautifully. It's very important that we do the training on a daily basis, the connections to our body, so that we do know when we're bracing, so that we know that we've also released the bracing. How do we know when we're releasing if we don't know when we're also contracting? And so there's so many polarities that come into healing versus the traumatic experience that could have been encoded into the body.
So this is really interesting, talking about movement and coordination of movement, producing good somatic experiences. I want to expand that a little bit and have us talk about for a second how these two articles actually play off of one another. There's some really good interplay, because I actually think when you combine these, it indicates that somatic movement practices can actually help memory consolidation, especially for people who have been through trauma. So think of it like this. If the cerebellum has a role in coordinating and regulating movement, cognitive thoughts, concentration, emotional regulation, all of these things, the more that we do healthy movement practices, including somatic movements, okay, the more trained the cerebellum will be to do its job correctly in a functional way, which allows us, when we start to look at the emotional memory side of it, tying in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, the cerebellum is going to play a role in helping us to eliminate unwanted emotional memories. Okay, so it kind of is going to take a look, and this happens on a non-cognitive level. So just for the colloquial language, you can consider this kind of part of your subconscious brain function. But imagine the cerebellum is looking at an emotional memory that has been recorded by the hippocampus is very broad. Like everything is scary, everything is dangerous, everything is threatening. The cerebellum is going to look at that and go, wait a second, that's way too big. You actually experienced one or just a few traumatic events that created this PTSD. We need to pare down that memory so that it doesn't sit in your brain as this blanket statement that applies to all of these different situations. We need to make it more targeted, more episodic, more time-oriented, so that it really only applies to the event when it occurred. That's the cerebellum's way of checking and ensuring accuracy of the emotional memories that are encoded. But the cerebellum can't do that if it's not functioning at a really high level. And so one of the ways we can train the cerebellum is by doing good movement practice, good somatic practices, good cerebellar training on top of the somatic work that we utilize. Okay, so it kind of creates a roadmap for neurosomatic practitioners to help their clients and go, yeah, we need sensory tools, we need somatic tools, but we also need coordination tools in movement so that the body can start to release some of the somatic trauma that it's holding. And most importantly, I think, so the cerebellum can be trained to help us reconfigure and re-educate how these memories need to be stored.
I find that so true in my own experience. Like having these practices for cerebellar training makes such a difference in how I'm moving through the world. And one of the neatest things about the study that, as you said, points to a lot of the stuff we've already been talking about in NSI was the cerebellum's influence on social stress and how better cerebellar function helped individuals to navigate and recover from social stress at a higher level. And when we're talking about CPTS, we want to remember this is such a relational wound. And so much of the stress response is happening in relationship and social situations. And so when we have the impairments that come from either the developmental trauma or the later CPTS experience, those can make social interactions more challenging, takes away our resilience, and leads to that high level of stress all of the time as we're trying to navigate through the world as relational beings. And we talked about this a lot in our stress response and relationship episode. And so if I know that I can work with my cerebellum to improve my adaptability and social resilience, that really leads me to think this is a very important place to focus in as I'm working on complex trauma resolution.
And really, we talk about this too with the NSI training, like you can't be present and dissociated at the same time. And presence is the truth of our emotions and our reality, because we can't heal what we cannot feel. So back to the cerebellum and all of these brain areas that we really want to get on board if they haven't been lit up as well. I know y'all have maybe heard me talk about that in my own experience where I didn't feel like areas of my brain were that lit up before. Now through NSI, I get to experience more continuity. And in my experiences of compounded PTS on top of CPTS, when I think of the ways I've been able to kind of reframe some of my experiences, adverse experiences that happen through development and all through our lives, I know that it can be a weird word to use the word reframe because it sounds so cognitive, but for me, that really happens in that place of resiliency, because that happens on a mind and body and soul level, everything coming together. Like my mind can sometimes cognitively understand things, but I know that I can't push my body to receive those messages. And I can only push my mind into a place once my body is really on board. And if I know the truth, I can feel the truth and I can be in the truths as I know them, not looking for the external validation of others. And not needing that external validation and talking about healing relationally, I know now how to ask for what I need in relationship for other people to give me that support. And I lead a faith-based life, so I don't ever feel like I'm really ever alone in my healing journey. And I think that's a huge aspect of my spiritual healing experience and on the path that I walk now.
Couple closing thoughts here as we wrap up. What does this mean for those who are working through trauma and like you're doing nervous system healing already? I think the best takeaway from this is that if you can add in some cerebellum work as well, it like gives you a boost, like a super jet fuel of brain activation to start integrating these different brain areas together. And what does that look like? A few coordination exercises, working through circles and figure eights with your joint movements. Picking up something like juggling scarves is an easy, fun way to do cerebellum training. It's going to integrate vision and movement and breathing all at the same time. So add in a few exercises that require a little bit higher level of coordination and accuracy, and you'll be tapping into that cerebellum in movement, which will also carry over into cognitive, emotional, and social situations as well.
And then I think for practitioners, just keeping in mind that it's so important to keep understanding how we can practically work with the brain and the nervous system to help people repattern and create some of this change at a non-cognitive level. There's so much that can be done to improve people's resilience through sensory inputs, through neural exercises that then can support memory integration, support bigger experiences of somatic processing. And so, I would encourage practitioners working with all types of clients to really start to think about some ways that they can utilize this research, understand the brain and the nervous system, and start to impact change at those different levels beyond just a cognitive framework. Because as we see from this research, a lot of times when there's not the memory integration or the ability to somatically process, it can be really challenging to just try to go through things in a cognitive way. So if we can make a more holistic approach, it really opens up a lot of possibilities for people to have a new experience. This is really the work that we're doing in NSI, using practical neural exercises and neuroscience education to begin to enhance and support all of these other beautiful cognitive frameworks.
Your nervous system shapes every session, every result, every client relationship you have. Coaches, therapists, and practitioners, if you're ready to upgrade your leadership from the inside out, join us for the workshop, The Neurosomatics of Leadership and Belief Change, on July 9th. It's free, live, and packed with actionable tools you can use immediately. Save your seat at neurosomatic.com/leadership. That's neurosomatic.com/leadership. Hope to see you there.